Let me introduce to you first Tommy Lou Davis, the Chief of Staff to the President and Vice President for Constituent Engagement.
Thank you. I have the good fortune of delivering the invocation, and then after we pray together, Lee Lawrence, who is President of Kappa Kappa Gamma, will come and do an official welcome. Laura was extremely, when you read her bio, you'll see that she was extremely involved on the Baylor campus. She was involved in STUFU, raising money for student scholarships, and she was also actively involved in Kappa. So it's been a tradition that we love to be able to be together and celebrate Laura's life. So Lee will come after I finish. So would you go with me now to the throne of grace as we pray together? Gracious and holy Heavenly Father, we come to you this evening with hearts of gratitude, joy, and awe. We are amazed by your love for us and your goodness to us. We are especially grateful tonight for Frank and Darba Jackson, the whole Jackson family, and for the life of Laura and the impact she had on this campus. May all of us commit to one another and to you to reflect in our lives your character of love, patience, forgiveness, kindness, and faithfulness, characteristics that Laura modeled so well. May we live always to please and honor you. Enable us to fix our thoughts on what is good and right, and to put into practice all that we learn from your word. Thank you for our blessings, for our country, our state, our community, and Baylor. Father, we just ask you to guide and direct our steps. And may you, who are the God of peace, grant your peace to all of us. For it is in the strong and precious name of our Lord Jesus that we ask these things. Amen.
As the president of Kappa Kappa Gamma, I'm honored to welcome you to the 21st Annual Laura Jackson Lectureship Series. I'm so thankful for Laura's parents, Dr. Frank and Darba Jackson, who make this event possible. Laura was an outstanding and respected member of the Baylor community who gave much of her time to activities and organizations on campus. It is with great joy that we remember her this evening. At this time, I would like to recognize some of the special people that are with us tonight. If you could please stand when you're called. Laura's parents, Dr. Frank and Darba Jackson. The friends and family of the Jacksons who have traveled from Longview and elsewhere. And finally, all of Laura's Kappa sisters. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy the evening.
Before I forget, Mr. Teachout asked me to remind you that there will be question and answers after he finishes his remarks. Why don't they like us? Is a question that has preoccupied the U.S. State Department at many times in our history, particularly in the 20th century during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, but at other times as well, including, pointedly, now, when cultural differences seem to underlie troublesome international relations as much, if not more, than do political differences. There are times when military threats can bear diplomatic fruit, perhaps, rattling the sword, we call it, or gunboat diplomacy. But there are far more situations that call for a more subtle foreign policy. During the international bipolar tension of the Cold War, the Soviet Union tried hard to show the world how interested it was in supporting high culture, how much it esteemed its famous ballet dancers and its symphony orchestras. American politicians worried that the non-aligned nations of the world were watching to see which superpower was more worthy of emulation and, presumably, alliance. American artists and intellectuals saw this too. As an official with the American Council of Learned Societies put it in 1954, a democracy which from the outside appears to be machined and spiritless will not win converts or friends. This little vignette of history points to a concern no less important now than it was then. Short of military force, are there cultural ways in which one nation can positively influence or improve its image in the eyes of the rest of the world? State Department types refer to this field of endeavor as soft power, and it comes to the front burner quite often as the United States finds itself wondering about how the rest of the world sees and esteems us. Such is the very important and indeed timeless field to which our guest tonight will be addressing his remarks. There are two things about Terry Teachout which, if you relate to either, will allow you at once to understand much about him. Number one is the fact that he comes from a small town in Missouri. This means that despite his living and working in New York City, he is a warm and genuine person. He's intensely likable, and he's interested in other people as people. It also means that he's a man of no pretense. What you see is what you get, and what you get is very impressive. The number two thing about our guest is that he is a bass player, which means that he's usually calm and subdued, but solid. It means he's a keen and cool observer of the showy and flashy world as it swirls around him loudly. And in the middle of that, you know he's going to lay down a good foundation on which to build something substantive. Terry Teachout is the chief drama critic for the Wall Street Journal and a widely published author on many topics. He is a critic at large for Commentary magazine. He's a former member of the National Council on the Arts. His most recent books include critically acclaimed biographies of two of the 20th century's great cultural figures, Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, both of whom played big parts in the American cultural diplomacy of the 1950s. He's a playwright, having adapted his Armstrong biography into a play entitled Satchmo at the Waldorf, which ran to great acclaim off-Broadway in New York. He's also written the libretti for 3 operas, which distinguishes you from any other Jackson lecturer, I think. He's currently teaching a graduate-level course at the Mannes School of Music in New York City on writing and speaking about music. His is a fortunate class of students, for this is a topic on which he is richly gifted, as you will discover tonight. Please join me in welcoming to Baylor and to the Jackson Lecture in World Affairs, Terry Teachout.
Well, I can't follow that. Is dessert ready? It's a tremendous pleasure for me to be back in Waco and at Baylor University, 2 places that I love well and don't get to visit nearly often enough. But it's almost as much of a surprise to me as I suspect it is to some of you that I find myself speaking this evening under the auspices of the Laura Blanche Jackson Endowed Lectureship in World Issues. I am, as you all know, a specialist not in international relations, but in the arts, fine, lively, and popular. What you may not know, though, in fact, I'd be flabbergasted if you did, is that I previously spent 6 years as a member of the editorial board of the New York Daily News, during which time I specialized in writing editorials about, of all things, foreign policy. You might be surprised to find out how much I know about how hard it is to get diplomats in Manhattan to pay their parking tickets. But I gave up that job in 1993 to concentrate on the arts. and nowadays I claim no special knowledge of or continuing involvement in foreign affairs. The world issues with which I concern myself in my latter-day capacity as the drama critic of the Wall Street Journal run more to the increasing prevalence of Brits on Broadway. So exactly what am I doing here tonight? Why on earth have I been invited to follow in the footsteps of such distinguished lecturers as Andy Card, Peter Berkowitz, Michael Mandelbaum, and my old friend and colleague, George Weigel? Would Laura Jackson, who by all accounts was a young woman of exceptional thoughtfulness and seriousness, have boggled to see me at the podium? I think I have a plausible answer to that pressing question, which is that when not sitting on the aisle, I spend a goodly part of my spare time writing biographies, the most recent of which, as David told you, have told the stories of the two most widely traveled jazz musicians of the 20th century, Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. Not only did both men perform all over the world, but Armstrong actually acquired and relished the nickname Ambassador Satch. That was, of course, a joke, but a perfectly serious one, for Armstrong and Ellington really did represent America to the world. So did Benny Goodman, Dave Brubeck, Dizzy Gillespie, and the many other jazz musicians who performed under the umbrella of the U.S. State Department throughout the 50s and 60s. So too did other American artists of every possible kind, Texas's own Van Cliburn foremost among them. But the story of Ambassador Satch is of particular interest, not only because he was the first jazz man to be widely described as an ambassador for the American way of life, but because his relationship with the State Department, which started out, as you will soon learn, very uneasily, blossomed over time into one of this country's most powerfully consequential ventures into what we now call cultural diplomacy. But first, a little history. America's new music was brought to the old world a century ago by Sidney Bechet and the original Dixieland Jazz Band, who arrived in England separately in 1919. By that time, a fair number of classical composers, including Claude Debussy and Igor Stravinsky, had already written pieces that were influenced by ragtime and its precursors. By 1913, the sound of American syncopation had circulated so widely that the New York Times could run a story headlined, "American Ragtime Sweeping Europe." 5 years later, Jim Europe's all-black Harlem Hellfighters Band was playing Clarinet Marmalade and Memphis Blues for French audiences. But it was the arrival of New Orleans-born musicians that lit the fire. Alas, no major jazz soloist performed in Europe between 1927, when Sidney Bechet was run out of England after getting into a fistfight with a lady of easy virtue, and 1932, when Louis Armstrong arrived on the SS Majestic. Armstrong, as it happens, was in a bit of trouble himself. He'd gotten himself into a scrape with two different sets of mobsters in Chicago and New York, and his manager came to the understandable conclusion that he might do well to spend some time abroad. Hence his first visit to Europe. Armstrong made his European debut at the London Palladium on July 18, 1932, accompanied by a pickup band of expatriate blacks and French musicians who were shipped over from Paris to play for him. As always, he made a tremendous impression, though many of his listeners didn't quite know what to make of him, and a few were actively hostile, in part because of the color of his skin. One reporter for the Daily Express described him as the ugliest man I have seen on the music hall stage. He looks and behaves like an untrained gorilla. But that didn't stop Armstrong from barnstorming up and down England, playing to packed houses in Birmingham, Glasgow, Liverpool, London, Nottingham, and York, or from returning to Europe the following year, at which time he played a command performance for King George V, then crossed the English Channel to appear in Denmark, France, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. In between those two visits, Duke Ellington brought his orchestra to Europe for the first time. He too made a great splash, but Ellington's visit to England left an equally deep impression on him. It showed him what it would feel like to work in a place where he could stay at the best hotels, some of them anyway, and be treated not as a second-class citizen, but like the great artist he was. Years later, Ellington spoke of what that unprecedented experience had meant to him. He said, "Europe is a very different world from this one. You can go anywhere and talk to anybody and do anything you like. When you've eaten hot dogs all your life and you're suddenly offered caviar, it's hard to believe it's true. If they think I'm that important, then maybe I have kind of said something. Maybe our music does mean something." Ellington went back to Europe a second time in 1939, but the outbreak of war forced him and Armstrong to remain stateside until 1948, when they resumed their European touring. The following year, Armstrong and his combo, the All-Stars, undertook a 5-week European tour that brought them to Basel, Bordeaux, Brussels, Copenhagen, Geneva, Helsinki, Lyon, Marseille, Milan, Naples, Paris, Rome, Rotterdam, and Stockholm. It was on this trip that Louis and Lucille, his wife, were invited to a private audience with Pope Pius, an occasion that furnished Armstrong with one of his all-time favorite anecdotes, which is told in many different versions, but this is the authentic one. He said, "The Pope was such a fine little old fellow, you know. He welcomes you so nice. The Pope say, 'Have you any children?' And I say, 'No, Daddy, but we're working on it.'" Now, there was nothing official about these visits. They were strictly business, but they were extraordinarily good business. To give you an idea of how beloved Louis Armstrong was, 40,000 cheering Swedish fans mobbed him at the Stockholm airport in 1949. And the fact that he was able to draw that kind of crowd in Europe did not go unnoticed in his native land. When the All-Stars headed back to Europe in 1956, it was for a continent-wide tour that was the brainchild of 4 different men: Joe Glazer, Armstrong's manager, George Avakian, his producer at Columbia Records, and Edward R. Murrow and Fred Friendly, the host and producer of See It Now, then America's most prestigious TV news program. A CBS camera crew filmed Armstrong and the All-Stars on stage and off, and the result was a widely viewed episode of See It Now, in which the sober-sided Murrow, who knew nothing about jazz, chatted up the world's greatest jazz musician backstage at a Paris nightclub. Murrow asked Armstrong, "What's the meaning of a cat?" This is what Satchmo told him. "A cat? Cat can be anybody from the guy in the gutter to a lawyer, doctor, the biggest man to the lowest man, but if he's in there with a good heart and enjoy the same music together, he's a cat." Ed Murrow may not have been much of a cat, but his timing was impeccable. 3 weeks earlier, the New York Times had run a front-page story informing its readers that America's secret weapon in the Cold War is a blue note in a minor key. Right now, its most effective ambassador is Louis Satchmo Armstrong. The headline of that story was, "United States has secret sonic weapon, jazz." And in it, the house organ of the American liberal establishment offered a pointed suggestion to the Eisenhower administration. What many thoughtful Europeans cannot understand is why the United States government, with all the money it spends for so-called propaganda to demote democracy, does not use more of it to subsidize the continental travels of jazz bands. With a small government subsidy, Armstrong might play the smaller intermediate towns and his tour be stretched to 6 months by train instead of 6 weeks by bus. That story had bureaucratic fingerprints all over it. They are crystal clear in this paragraph. Somewhere in the official files of one of Washington's myriad agencies, all this has been spelled out. But because nothing has been done about it, More than one observant American traveling the continent has remarked, "We don't know our own strength." I should point out that the Eisenhower administration was already engaged in high-level cultural diplomacy. In 1954, President Eisenhower had requested and received from the Senate a special appropriation to support foreign tours by American artists. The Cold War was then at its height, and anti-Americanism was on the rise, and Ike was concerned about the way that America was viewed by the rest of the world. "Our successes," he said, "are described by them in terms of automobiles and not in terms of worthwhile culture of any kind." And the example Ike gave of the kind of worthwhile culture that he wanted to export was the recent world tour of Porgy and Bess, in which an all-black cast of American singers performed George Gershwin's opera throughout Europe, Latin America, the Middle East, and the Soviet Union. It was only a short step from Porgy and Bess to full-fledged jazz, and America had already taken that step by starting to broadcast jazz around the world. In 1956, the Voice of America launched one of its most successful programs ever, Music USA, a weekly series that was beamed overseas via shortwave. The theme song for that show was "Take the A Train," and Duke Ellington would always figure prominently on Music USA. The Duke believed that jazz and freedom were consubstantial, so much so that he actually recorded public service announcements on behalf of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, which broadcast his music to countries in which it was a crime to listen to jazz. He told those listeners, "When people behind the Iron Curtain tune to Radio Free Europe for a jazz program, they're getting two things at once: the music they want to hear and a little exercise in individual freedom." Ellington was not just currying favor with the White House by taping those announcements. He meant every word. In fact, he was so adamantly opposed to Soviet communism that when he toured the Soviet Union in 1971, he insisted for the first and only time that his musicians fly in the first class section alongside their leader, thus demonstrating the difference between life under communism and capitalism, where anybody with enough money to pay for a ticket could travel first class. Now, that kind of gesture wasn't Louis Armstrong's style. Except for a passionate belief in civil rights, he had no political convictions of any kind. But that didn't stop the New York Times from touting him as a possible jazz ambassador, and when the Times touted, Washington listened. 2 weeks after calling Satchmo America's secret sonic weapon, the paper ran a follow-up story announcing that the State Department had decided to sponsor foreign tours by American jazzmen. The White House earmarked nearly $100,000, serious money in 1956, to send Dizzy Gillespie's band to the Middle East for the first in a long series of government-sponsored jazz tours whose purpose was to show the Third World that American capitalism really was better than Soviet communism. Why didn't the State Department choose Louis Armstrong for its first tour? Undoubtedly because he was already booked solid, playing to sold-out houses across Europe, including a performance in West Berlin, ground zero of the Cold War. But that didn't stop George Avakian, his record producer, who knew a good thing when he saw it, from rushing to capitalize on all the free publicity by taping an Armstrong album to which he gave the perfect title of Ambassador Satch. The cover of that album, which is still in print, is a photo of Satchmo, decked out in full diplomatic toggery, dressed in a cutaway and holding a dispatch case in one hand and his trumpet in the other, with an ear-to-ear grin on his face. Now, I'll tell you a little secret about why Armstrong was smiling in that photo, or rather, I'll let him tell it for me. This is what he confessed to a friend. It was the same morning I had already made a date with my connection to pick up half a pound of fine muta, that is, marijuana. So when you see that picture of Ambassador Satch, you know he's got half a pound of fine jive right there in his satchel. Now, I don't know whether John Foster Dulles' State Department knew about Armstrong's fondness for Muta, though I do know that J. Edgar Hoover was well aware of it. But it didn't matter, because Armstrong had already been approved for a future tour. But Ed Murrow had gotten into the game. His See It Now profile of Armstrong was so well received that Murrow and Fred Friendly decided to expand it into a theatrical documentary called Satchmo the Great. To that end, CBS had sent the All-Stars to Ghana, where they played on camera for 100,000 ecstatic listeners. All that was missing was a grand finale. So Friendly called up Avakian and cut a deal to get Leonard Bernstein, another Columbia artist, to invite Armstrong and the All-Stars to play with the New York Philharmonic as part of the orchestra's summer series of outdoor concerts. In return, See It Now would film the concert and include it in Satchmo the Great. It was, of course, a very big deal for Louis Armstrong to make his New York Philharmonic debut. In those days, jazz musicians didn't routinely perform with symphony orchestras. Benny Goodman had been doing it for years, but he played Mozart, not the blues. This was different, and so was Louis Armstrong. He was universally regarded as the first genius of jazz, just as Bernstein was considered the first great American orchestral conductor, and one who, in addition, knew his way around the world of popular music. It was, in other words, a summit meeting between two worlds of art. But it was also, like the All-Stars trip to Ghana, what TV viewers would later learn to call a media event, one that was staged solely for the purpose of being telecast. And Louis Armstrong, though he was still a star in 1956, was no longer shining quite so brightly. To be sure, TV had introduced him to a generation of Americans who knew little of the crucial part he had played in shaping the sound and style of early jazz, but the teenagers of 1956 had ideas of their own. 2 days before Armstrong and Bernstein played together, Ed Sullivan announced that Elvis Presley had agreed to be a guest on his Sunday night TV variety show. Now, Satchmo was still playing the Ed Sullivan show long after Elvis had turned into a reclusive self-caricature, but the writing was on the wall. With the coming of rock and roll, Armstrong's once revolutionary music had become old-fashioned at last. But Satchmo the Great hadn't lost his knack for pleasing a crowd by playing and singing from his heart and soul. And he was, if anything, more popular abroad than he was in his native land. In Ghana, he lunched with Kwame Nkrumah, the prime minister, then played for a mammoth crowd that made no attempt to contain its collective excitement. Barrett Deems, the drummer for the All-Stars, described it this way: "I have never seen a reception like that in my life. You talk about the Beatles today, you should have seen Louis. You would have thought he was a god. People just swept him off his feet." After that, Armstrong returned to the United States and joined forces with Bernstein in the New York Philharmonic, playing St. Louis blues in New York before a near-hysterical capacity crowd. Many of the listeners, unable to restrain their feet, bounced into the aisles, the New York Times reported the next day. Dancing erupted sporadically throughout the stadium. After the song, Bernstein put his arm around Armstrong and told the audience that when the Philharmonic plays the St. Louis Blues, we are only doing a blown-up imitation of what he does. And what he does is real and true and honest and simple and even noble. Needless to say, Satchmo gave as good as he got, he said. "This is my first time playing with a symphony orchestra, and as we cats say, it gassed me, man, it gassed me." That was part of why the State Department wanted to send the All-Stars on a tour of the Soviet Union. Not only was Armstrong the world's best-known and best-loved jazzman, but the government officials who were planning his tour felt sure that he wouldn't stir up any controversy. In particular, they took it for granted that he wouldn't engage in indiscreet talk about civil rights before foreign audiences, and they had good reason to feel confident about that. Armstrong had always been careful never to comment in public about controversial matters. His consistent refusal to do so was one of the reasons why younger jazz musicians like Dizzy Gillespie and Miles Davis had criticized him for what Gillespie called his Uncle Tom-like subservience. But they were wrong about Louis Armstrong. He was the furthest thing from an Uncle Tom, and neither Dizzy nor the State Department had any idea that his patience, like that of his people, was wearing thin. In the 3 years since the U.S. Supreme Court had ordered that America's public schools be desegregated with all deliberate speed, the civil rights movement had started to move faster than anyone in the White House had anticipated. In 1955, Emmett Till was murdered in Mississippi for the capital crime of being black, and the white men who bragged of killing him were acquitted by an all-white jury. 4 months later, Rosa Parks refused to give her bus seat to a white passenger in Montgomery, Alabama, and when she was arrested, a local Baptist minister named Martin Luther King led a boycott of the city's bus system, which was officially desegregated in December of 1956. Change was in the wind, and Satchmo knew it. A month later, he went on The Ed Sullivan Show and sang, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen." He said nothing about the Montgomery boycott. He didn't have to. His music said it all. From there, he went to Knoxville, where the audience was separate but equal. 2,000 whites sat on one side of the auditorium, 1,000 blacks on the other. Even that was too much integration for an unknown man in a passing car who threw a stick of dynamite at the auditorium, then drove off into the night. It exploded while Armstrong was singing a song. He paused and then said to the terrified audience, "That's all right, it's just the phone." He was calm and collected that night. But on September 17th, 1957, he blew up in front of Larry Lubenow, a journalism student from the University of North Dakota, who was interviewing him for the Grand Forks Herald. And he blew up for an even more compelling reason. Satchmo was mad at the President of the United States. Armstrong was staying at the Dakota Hotel in Grand Forks, whose bell captain had tipped off Lubenow that the legendary trumpeter was the first black person who had ever been allowed to stay there. Lubenow begged his editor to let him interview Armstrong. The editor agreed, but warned the young reporter not to ask any questions about politics. It happened, though, that the politics of race were in the news that week. In Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 black children whose parents believed that Brown versus Board of Education meant what it said were seeking, without success, to enroll in the city's Central High School. Governor Orville Faubus, seeing a chance to enhance his political standing in Arkansas, ordered the state's National Guard to maintain the peace and order of the community by surrounding the school. The Guardsmen were joined by a mob of white segregationists who were determined to keep the Little Rock Nine out of Central High. One of the little children later remembered, "I tried to see a friendly face somewhere in the mob, someone who maybe would help. I looked into the face of an old woman, and it seemed a kind face, but when I looked at her again, she spat on me." President Eisenhower met with Faubus on September 14th, but so far had taken no steps to ensure that the children would be allowed to enroll in school. Instead, they stayed home as the rest of the country looked on in anguish. 3 days later, Larry Lubenow snuck into Armstrong's suite, having persuaded the bell captain to let him bring the trumpeter his room service dinner. Lubenow immediately admitted what he'd done, and the two men, who hit it off at once, chatted about jazz. But then Lubenow brought up Little Rock, and a pleasant conversation abruptly turned into a one-sided harangue. "It's getting almost so bad. A colored man hasn't got any country," Armstrong said. He added that President Eisenhower was two-faced and had no guts. And then he called Orville Faubus a name that in a room full of stained glass, I think perhaps I will not pronounce out loud. Then Armstrong went even further. He told Lubnow that he had no intention whatsoever of touring the Soviet Union for the State Department. He said, "The way they are treating my people in the South, the government can go to hell." How, he asked, could a black man possibly represent the United States abroad when it was treating its own black citizens so shabbily at home? He said, "The people over there would ask me, 'What's wrong with my country? What am I supposed to say?'" Now try, if you will, to imagine the look on that cub reporter's face as he sat there, scribbling furiously. He knew that Louis Armstrong had just handed him the story of a lifetime, but because of that word, he also knew that the story was completely unprintable. So he begged Satchmo to come up with a euphemism for the obscenity that he's used to describe Faubus. And after a bit of back and forth, the two men settled on calling the governor of Arkansas an uneducated plowboy. When I wrote Satchmo at the Waldorf, my one-man play about Armstrong, I made a point of dramatizing that scene, and that line always brings down the house. Lubnow then made a beeline for the city room, where he wrote up the interview. It took some doing for him to persuade his editor that Armstrong really had said what he said. But once he did, the Associated Press hastened to put this story on the wires. Trumpet player Louis Armstrong said last night he had given up plans for a government-sponsored trip to the Soviet Union. Mr. Armstrong said President Eisenhower had no guts and described Governor Orville E. Faubus of Arkansas as an uneducated plowboy. The AP's Washington desk then called Foggy Bottom for comment and tacked on this paragraph. In Washington, the State Department declined to comment on Mr. Armstrong's statements. Officials made no attempt, however, to hide the concern they caused. Mr. Armstrong was regarded by the State Department as perhaps the most effective unofficial goodwill ambassador this country had. They said Soviet propagandists undoubtedly would seize on Mr. Armstrong's words. Every major newspaper in America ran the story the next day, and it was picked up by CBS and NBC on their nightly newscasts. Other black celebrities rushed to identify themselves with Armstrong's furious words. Jackie Robinson praised him for his candor and said that President Eisenhower was lacking in leadership. Eartha Kitt called Ike a man without a soul. How can he possibly sit and not have any emotion for what is happening right under his nose? He's not even two-faced. He hasn't even shown us one side of his face. And a State Department spokesman, this time speaking on the record, confirmed that the White House had approached Armstrong about touring behind the Iron Curtain. Mr. Armstrong, he said, has made a tremendous hit wherever he has gone, and we've always been pleased when he has gone abroad. Think of it. In 1956, a black entertainer speaks out about segregation, and Dwight Eisenhower's State Department runs scared. And after that, Ike changed his mind. Now, Dwight Eisenhower was no great friend of blacks in America. Though he claimed to regard racial segregation as criminally stupid, his snap response to Brown versus Board of Education had been to assure Chief Justice Earl Warren that the white opponents of the decision only wanted to make sure that their sweet little girls are not required to sit in school alongside some big, overgrown Negroes. Nevertheless, the President of the United States wasn't about to let a mere governor defy him, and so he ordered that the Little Rock Nine be admitted to Central High, declaring that law cannot be flouted with impunity by any individual or any mob of extremists. What's more, he backed up his strong words with equally strong action. He federalized the 10,000-member Arkansas National Guard and sent the Army's 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock to restore order. It was the first time that military troops had been sent into a southern city since Reconstruction. Within hours, the crisis was over. And afterwards, Armstrong sent Eisenhower a congratulatory telegram. This is what it said, verbatim. Daddy, if and when you decide to take those little Negro children personally into Central High School along with your marvelous troops, please take me along. Oh God, it would be such a great pleasure, I assure you. May God bless you, President. You have a good heart. Was it possible that Armstrong's harsh criticism had swayed the president? It isn't likely. Eisenhower's mind didn't work that way. But the State Department's response to his statement left no possible doubt that it had been noticed by the administration, and there were many who thought that it must have made a difference. The trumpeter Max Kaminsky told a British jazz magazine, "I think it was what Lewis said that got Ike up off his rear off this Little Rock business. That episode is one hell of a smear over America, and it takes a hell of a lot of guts for Lewis to stand up and say the things he said. Lewis is not an Uncle Tom. He's a great man, apart from the fact that he's the greatest jazz trumpet player that ever lived." Now that celebrities are accustomed to sounding off about political matters, it's possible to underestimate the significance of Armstrong's statement. The All-Stars, after all, had always played for segregated audiences, and Joe Armstrong never complained to Joe Glaser about it. That same year, he had actually told a black reporter, "I never question owners of dance halls or my manager about the racial pattern of places I am contracted to play. I have been with Joe Glaser too many years to worry about where I play and for whom." Nor would he ever take part in civil rights demonstrations. He explained on another occasion, "My life is music. They would beat me on the mouth if I marched, and without my mouth, I couldn't be able to blow my horn. They would beat Jesus if he was black and marched." But it's unfair and ahistorical to judge the Armstrong of 1957 by the standards of 2014. In 1957, it was no small thing for a black man, even Satchmo, to have gone up against one of the most beloved public figures of the century. Everybody in America liked Ike, and everybody respected him. Not only was he the man who led America's troops on D-Day, but his nickname and his grin were as famous as Armstrong's own. Norman Rockwell said, "When he smiled, it was just like the sun came out." It would have been infinitely easier for Louis Armstrong to have played it safe and kept his mouth shut. Instead, he took on the man in the Norman Rockwell painting and won. Even more remarkably, he was immediately forgiven by the public. The Ford Motor Company made an abortive attempt to boot Armstrong off the Edsel Show, an upcoming TV extravaganza with which Ford planned to launch its new line of cars. But CBS executives declined to cooperate, and Ford backed down. The All-Stars appeared as scheduled, performing alongside Bing Crosby, Bob Hope, and Frank Sinatra less than a month after Armstrong's outburst had put him on America's front pages, and no one is known to have uttered a word of complaint. That is how white audiences felt about Satchmo. They had been welcoming him into their homes via television for the past decade, and in so doing, they had come to love him. This love may well have been Armstrong's foremost contribution to the cause of racial justice, a contribution that no other black man in America, not even Martin Luther King, was capable of making in 1957. The following April, The New Yorker ran a cartoon that showed a group of soberly suited Washingtonians sitting around a conference table discussing an urgent matter of state. The caption read as follows: "This is a diplomatic mission of the utmost delicacy. The question is, who's the best man for it, John Foster Dulles or Satchmo?" Now, Secretary Dulles never did get around to sending Satchmo abroad, but his successor, Christian Herter, invited the All-Stars to tour Africa on behalf of the State Department in 1960. This time, Armstrong happily said yes, taking care to dodge political questions throughout the 27-city tour. He explained, "The reason I don't bother with politics is the words are so big. By the time they break them down to my size, the joke is over." And that is the amazing story of Ambassador Satch, who kept on playing for standing room crowds all over the world, often under the auspices of the United States government, until his death in 1971. For the world never stopped loving Louis Armstrong or jazz. And I think that one of the reasons for the perennial popularity of America's homegrown music is the very same one that the State Department had in mind in 1956, when it persuaded the New York Times to run that front-page story calling jazz America's secret weapon in the Cold War. Dave Brubeck, who was the second American jazz musician to go on a state-sponsored foreign tour, summed it up when he told his audiences that no dictatorship can tolerate jazz. It is the first sign of a return to freedom. As for Armstrong, he put it even better when he played West Berlin in 1955. He told a reporter for Newsweek, "A lot of them Russian cats jumped the iron fence to hear Satchmo, which goes to prove that music is stronger than nations." Well, maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. Maybe that's just wishful thinking. But whenever America's greatest musical ambassador put his trumpet to his lips and blew, you couldn't help but believe that he was telling the righteous truth. Raise your hand, and I will hasten to meet you. Would somebody please like to kick it off? Yes, sir.
Is cultural diplomacy dead?
I don't think it will ever be dead. I think different administrations, different times put a different value on it. I think, however, it was especially important in this period, and it was especially important when we were trying to reach out to countries that only saw us through the double prism of anti-Americanism and of our own reputation in this country for racism, for prejudice, for segregation. The State Department was extremely aware of this. That was why they chose jazz to be the music. That was why they chose integrated groups, all of them, Dizzy Gillespie's band, the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the Armstrong All-Stars, all integrated. It was a wordless message that they want to send that this was the real America, the true America. And I think that messages like that are always going to be relevant when this country wants to project what it's really like to be in America, what America means, what American culture is about. One of the very best things we can offer is our art. So I don't think we're ever going to see an end of cultural diplomacy, but I think we will see administrations that have better and worse notions of how to do it and how important it is. But it's always going to be around. It always should be around. Yes, thank you. Yes, speak up if you're behind me.
Thank you. Would you speak briefly about his early days? And is the story really true about the orphanage and the old beat-up trumpet? I know this is not germane to your topic, but I taught music for many years, and I love telling that story. I'm not sure I was telling the truth.
Well, I know the truth. Louis Armstrong was not born when he thought he was. He thought he was born on July the 4th, 1900, which was indeed too good to be true. But it was close enough for jazz. He was born in New Orleans. His mother was a part-time prostitute. His father, Armstrong said, abandoned the family the day he was born. And after that, that family lived a hand-to-mouth existence. Armstrong started working as a small child to help put food in the pot. The most important odd jobs that he did, he was taken up by a family of Russian Jews in New Orleans, the Karnofskys. They were junk peddlers, ran a junk wagon. And they took him in. He would come to Seder with them. They'd bring him home after a long day on the wagon. We're talking about a boy who was 4 or 5, 6 years old. And they'd say to him, you know, it's going to be too late for you to get your supper. Why don't you eat with us? And he would sit down at the Karnofskys' table and dine with them. He learned Jewish songs in Satchmo at the Waldorf, my play. We actually taught John Douglas Thompson, the actor, a Shabbat song phonetically in Hebrew to sing in Armstrong's voice. I won't try to do that one for you. But in addition to all this, and here we come to the answer to your question, the Karnofskys loaned him the money to buy his first cornet, a beat-up old cornet at a pawn shop. Years and years and years later, some of you are old enough to remember the TV show I've Got a Secret? Well, Armstrong was the guest, and his secret to the panel was that his first trumpet teacher was backstage, and he had the horn with him. And that TV show survives. You can actually find it on YouTube, and it's quite a thing to see those two standing together. So yes, in essence, your story is true. And it was courtesy of a family of Russian Jews that Louis Armstrong became the Satchmo that the world knows.
Did Mr. Armstrong have a good relationship, working relationship with Barbra Streisand when they were doing the film Hello, Dolly?
Well, he was only there for the afternoon. But afterwards, he praised her more extravagantly than he praised any singer in the later years of his life. Went on the BBC, he'd just done the filming for Hello, Dolly, and he raved about her. He said Barbra Streisand and the Beatles, those were the two acts that impressed him most in the later years of his life. So whether or not they got along, I don't think they had quite enough time not to get along. They certainly got along better than Barbra Streisand got along with Walter Matthau. I think that's a pretty safe bet. But there isn't anybody that Louis Armstrong didn't get along with, except once, Benny Goodman, but that's another story. In working on my biography, Pops, A Life of Louis Armstrong, I talked to many people who knew Armstrong, and I never talked to anybody who didn't love him. Just that simple. Someone was raising a hand in this direction. Yes. I see you, and you're next.
Mr. Teachout, this is really a question for Terry Teachout, the biographer, and the responsibilities that go along with that. So I'm going to pull together two thoughts, and then I'll throw them to you to comment on. The first one is, I've always loved this title. Some of you students should read this. A Baylor professor who was published as one of the Yale Younger series of poets, Bill Davis. It's the greatest title, One Way to Reconstruct the Scene. That's a great line. And the other one is, this is one of my favorite thoughts from St. Augustine, the Confessions, and he talks about the past. And he says, there is no past, nor present, nor future. I'll paraphrase because it's a really cool essay. But there is the present of the past, and the present of the present, and the present of the future. And as a biographer, since you have specialized in this and you've given us a very beautiful context tonight, I'm curious about your sense of your responsibility. And I'm always wondering if you were writing these biographies 10 years from now or 20 years ago, how different you would reconstruct the scene, how differently?
Well, those are wonderful questions. And remember that after writing Pops, I wrote a play about Louis Armstrong. And the difference between them goes straight to the point of what you're talking about. The biographer's first responsibility is, insofar as he can discern it, to tell the truth. The playwright gets to work it just a little bit to make the story a little better, a little sharper. But I felt that my job in writing Pops was to try to there are all sorts of apocryphal stories about Louis Armstrong, all sorts of quotations that turned out that can't be traced to a primary source. Some perfectly wonderful stories that just aren't true. No, he did not give Richard Nixon a suitcase full of marijuana to take through customs when he was vice president. Everybody thinks that story is true, and it is completely unverifiable. In Satchmo's case, the truth is really quite good enough. But, of course, it's, you start with the facts. But then you have to bring the facts alive. You have to bring them alive for people younger than me. I am 58. People who never saw him. I never saw him perform live, but I saw him on television. I saw him on the Ed Sullivan Show. I'm speaking not just to those of you who have living memories of Armstrong as a biographer, but people who are younger, who don't know the context. Like they say in The Music Man, people who don't know the territory. And so I try to take the kind of historical context that I gave you a taste of in this lecture in the specific context of Armstrong and foreign policy and cultural diplomacy, and fill these gaps in so that a person who doesn't know anything about Armstrong, maybe a person who just heard a record of his, just heard Hello Dolly, just for the first time encountered him, can read my book and find out what kind of person he was and why it matters. Now, I had the colossal advantage in writing this book of being the first biographer to work with Armstrong's private tapes. Armstrong he and Bing Crosby may well have been the first two private Americans to own a tape recorder. They bought them in 1947, right after World War II. Tape recorder was a German invention. They were brought over here. Armstrong, at first, some of you are old enough to remember what it felt like to get your hands on a tape recorder for the first time. You played with it, and he played with it. And then he recorded his shows so that he could listen to them and perfect them. But somewhere along the line, Louis Armstrong, he knew who he was. He knew what he was. And he decided, willy-nilly, to create a kind of archive. And so he kept everything. There are thousands of extant letters, handwritten letters and typewriters by Louis Armstrong, thousands of photographs, all on deposit at the Armstrong Archives in New York. And then there are the tapes. There are hundreds and hundreds of reels of tape, ranging from the contents of Armstrong's record collection to tapes in which he just sat down in the den of his home in Queens, turned the tape recorder on, and started telling stories, to nights somewhere on the road where he sets the tape recorder up in the corner of the dressing room or the corner of his hotel room, switches it on, and lets it run. And these tapes survive. Now, they stored them in the attic of his house, and it wasn't climate controlled. So everybody knew about the tapes, but they assumed that they would not be playable because an audio tape is a rather fragile thing. They were all playable. So when the Armstrong Archive took over control of the tapes, they transferred them all to digital media, to compact discs. They indexed them. God bless the person who did that. And then they admitted researchers, anybody who wanted to listen to them. And I was the first biographer to have access to these tapes. So you talk about reducing the distance between the present and the past. I never met him. I never saw him live. But I would sit with a pair of headphones in the Armstrong Archives, and I would listen to pieces of his life. The funniest one, the one I always tell this story when I'm talking about Armstrong. It's touching, but it's also absurd and wonderful. Sometime, the tape is impossible to date exactly, but it's probably the early 60s. He's out on the road in a hotel, Lord knows where. Lucille, his wife, is with him. He's in the hotel room, it's 3 a.m, and he decides that he wants to make a little hanky-panky with the missus. And Lucille is really not interested in this. It's 3 in the morning. She's not having any of this at all. And he's very insistent. He says, you know, you got to keep the horn percolating if you want to have the life you want to have. He actually said that to her. So they're having a bit of back and forth, and then suddenly there's a pause, and you can almost hear her looking around the room. And she says, "Is that thing running? You run that back, you erase that off." And Armstrong says to her, "I can't do that, that's for posterity." Well, okay, flash forward, 40 years, however long it was, 50 years. And here I am, I'm wearing the white gloves that you wear when you're sitting in an archive, and, all very proper and academic, and I've got these headphones on, and I'm hearing this. And I think to myself, that's me. I'm posterity. I am the person he saved this tape for. And the story's in my book. So, Augustine would know what I was up to. You really, in an experience like that, the biographer is able to travel through time and efface the distance between past and present and bring the past into the immediate present and bring the subject to life before your eyes. And that's why I was so lucky to have these tapes. And if I do say so myself, if Pops is a good book, and people seem to think it's pretty good, that's one of the reasons why. Somebody back here had a hand up. You, sir.
This is a bit more weighty.
You need not be near the center aisle. I will come to you. Yes.
Thinking and reflecting a little bit about your speech and your talk here, jettison forward to today and our situations that exist in the Middle East and the cultural differences that exist. What lessons do you think the United States government could take out of this as a means of maybe helping the whole situation between us and the Middle East?
Well, I think Satchmo answered that at the end of my speech, that he really, somewhere in there, he really did think, as he said, that music is stronger than nations. Now, I'm not a Pollyanna. This is a foreign policy series. We're all realists of one sort or another, and we understand that it isn't always that simple. But when you consider the line that a man like Armstrong reached across in his own country, this line of race, it's hard not to think that if the arts are or are not a universal language, I don't know whether they are or they're not, they're certainly an immensely powerful language. And the message they send is, we are like you. We value what you value. We value beauty. We have humane values. We are not what you think we are. Remember the Voyager, the spacecraft that was sent out into interstellar space with a phonograph recording containing, it has the cavatina from Beethoven's Opus 130 Quartet, and Blind Willie Johnson singing Dark Was the Night, and I think Chuck Berry singing Johnny Be Good, and Louis Armstrong is on there too. And of course, the purpose of that message is to say, this is who we are. If we use that kind of thing to reach out over that kind of distance, I hope, I pray, that we can use it to reach out to what, in a sense, perhaps is an even greater distance, the distance between cultures, and say, we are like you. Maybe not like your government, maybe not like your rulers, but we are like you. And that is the hope of cultural diplomacy. It is a fundamentally idealistic premise. We must not pretend that it's anything more than it is. But what it is, I think, is quite powerful enough and gives us maybe a kind of hope that other forms of diplomacy to which they do not have access.
Did they have children?
No. Well, there are two people who claim to be natural children of Louis Armstrong. One of them, the claim is not possible. There's a woman for whom it is at least remotely possible. My own suspicion is that Armstrong was sterile. He smoked marijuana every day, which depresses the sperm count. And his wife thought that he was sterile. But he never had any children that we definitely know about. So that's the most I can tell you. Can we take, does anybody have I want a really good one to go out on because it looks like I'm getting the cue to quit here. So somebody give me something fabulous and I will rush to put the microphone in your face. Come on now, now's your chance. Okay. Actually, no, this gentleman hasn't asked, so.
Well, I don't know about fabulous, but would you offer some observations about the way in which the State Department and the federal government dealt with Louis Armstrong and maybe Duke Ellington as opposed to Paul Robeson?
Different time, different place. I mean, and Robeson wasn't, nobody thought of sending Robeson out as a cultural ambassador. But most particularly, in Robeson's case, there was the question of his public statements about the Soviet Union. And obviously, at that time, under those circumstances, that was the worst possible thing he could have said in terms of relations with the State Department. Whereas Armstrong is apolitical. Ellington was actually a lifelong Republican. This is a fact you will find in my book, which is not commonly known. But he was a determined, militant anti-communist. And so from that point of view, those two men were much safer choices when you consider what the nature of the mission was. Because this cultural diplomacy was at this time, in the 50s and early 60s, was focused most particularly both on the Cold War and the projection of the Cold War into the Third World. So I think it just made good sense that they focused on the people that they focused on. How Robeson was treated by the government is a separate question, not relating to this. In my experience, which is considerable, artists are naive creatures. They very rarely have the faintest idea of how the world works, which is why they make the most extraordinary statements. But once in a while, one of them, like Louis Armstrong, gets hold of the root of the matter and says the right thing at the right moment. But you don't want to, I often say, if I could have all artists disenfranchised, I would happily give up my own vote as well. Thank you.
We'd like to invite you to join us for a reception after the talk. Thank you very much for coming.